Hello, and welcome to the Narcissus Now podcast series, featuring artists and thinkers from Narcissus Now, the Myth Reimagined, an arts and ideas festival celebrating the newly renovated Onassis Cultural Center in New York. The festival is a 4-day celebration and inquiry into the dynamic, complex, and intriguing myth of Narcissus. The voices that you will hear in this series are those of people who are taking part in the festival, either as performers or thinkers, people who have shared their knowledge and insight into the relevance of this legendary myth and how it plays out in contemporary culture. My name is Tani Katenjian, and here I speak with professor, author, translator, essayist, and critic Daniel Mendelsohn. Professor Mendelsohn has been interested in Greek language and history since his youth. The title of his first book, The Elusive Embrace, was inspired by the myth of Narcissus, and he has explored this theme and many others over the years, having written 5 more books, including the international bestseller The Lost, A Search for Six of 6 Million, and Waiting for the Barbarians, essays from the classics to pulp culture. He contributes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and Harper's, and has been called our most irresistible literary critic by the New York Times. A strikingly handsome gay man, Mendelsohn speaks eloquently and intuitively about the narcissism of homoerotic relationships and how they manifest in today's culture. His knowledge of the Greeks and Greek classics is deep and profound, and he shared his thoughts with me at his home at Bard College, where he is a professor. Stay tuned.
Like many young kids, I had actually been sort of obsessed from the age of like 8 or 9 with ancient Egypt, pyramids. And I think there's something about the size of things in Egypt, the monumentality of the physical culture, which is so impressive to young children, like dinosaurs, right? So things that are big are interesting because they're so small, right? But I segued at a certain point into Greece. I mean, who can ever understand really the mechanisms of these interests in young children? But I was hooked, I think, already by the age of, say, 10 or 11. My father had a lot to do with it. I remember he was putting books into my hands already when I was 11 and 12 about ancient Greece. And I was already also interested in the language at a very early age, and I liked languages, and I grew up hearing a lot of languages, and I think that sort of sparked an interest in the Greek language. So I would say by the age of 12, I was sort of fully hooked. Like a lot of kids, mythology seemed to me very glamorous and interesting, especially if you come out of a sort of a Jewish household. My mother's father was a quite religious Jew, and there's something about the licentiousness of Greek and Roman mythology that's so alluring. In fact, I always like to quote, there was a wonderful classicist who died in the early 90s, as I recall, called Jack Winkler, who began an article with the line, he was very funny and irreverent, and he began a scholarly article, as I recall, with a line that went something like, who could resist the Greeks, naked statues and bad behavior, and there's something about the eroticism of the Greek religious narratives and also the physical culture, right? That here's a culture in which it's perfectly okay to be naked. That's something fascinating, I think, if you're coming out of our culture. Also, as a secretly gay adolescent, of course, there's another layer to the fascination of this culture that is so open, both about nakedness and the nakedness of male bodies, and also a moral system in which homoerotic desire is not problematic. So I think for me, as for many people over the centuries, it provides as kind of an outlet, right? So I would, by the time I was pubescent, I was completely hooked. I was just there, and I knew I wasn't ever going to be going anywhere else.
And you haven't. And as
well,
I mean, you've gone lots of other directions, but that interest has still remained, which I think is fascinating, how we get interested in these things when we're young and they stay and they persist in our lives.
Well, it imprints, I would say. You're sort of imprinted. And in my case, so that's sort of the, whatever hooks you. But then once you get into a serious study of a culture, then all the other interesting things take over. I would say also for me, the language is when you study the classics and you study classical languages, which are very difficult and highly systematized and structured languages, that affects how you see things, right? Greek, you can't know Greek unless you understand a kind of a very rigorous grammatical system, and that inevitably inflects other things about how you read things. So, but I would say that whatever I've ended up writing about, from Game of Thrones to Mel Brooks producers to a whole range of things that I write about as a critic, the Greek kind of models have continued to be my models, and I would say a lot of my writing is the sort of point, in some sense, of a lot of my writing is to show that these archetypes, these Hellenic archetypes, continue to be with us and provide a very interesting lens for looking at both high and low culture today.
It's very true. As I've been doing these interviews, it's fascinating how it does hit both high and low culture. I mean, in fact, somehow, I don't know why this came into my thinking in the course of reading about you and learning about you. I remembered this moment in that film Birdcage. I don't know if you've seen it with Robin Williams, where he brings out his dinner plates. Yeah.
He serves the soup, and then they realize it's the pornographic ancient Greek soup bowls.
Yes, exactly.
With the pictures of boys fucking.
Exactly.
And that they keep filling the soup bowls because they don't want the uptight future in-laws to get to the bottom and see the pornographic images. Yeah, it's very funny.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It can be interpreted in so many different ways.
Yeah.
You can understand it as a scholar, and you can just laugh at it as a viewer.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. But your father, just to go back, and you were saying he was part of the inspiration of your interest. He was multilingual, correct? He spoke many languages.
Well, my mother's father, my grandfather, was multilingual, as were a lot of these Eastern European Jews from small towns who grew up speaking many languages. My father was an inspiration to me. My father is actually a mathematician, but he had been a great sort of Latin jock in high school and always prided himself on having been a superior student in Latin, and then he dropped it, and he always regretted not having gone on with it. So I think that, he was always a great supporter of my passion for Greek and Roman culture, and he was very enthusiastic, which many parents would not be, when I declared my major in classics. He never said, oh, what are you going to do with that, or how are you going to make a living? So he was a great supporter of this, and he always liked to sort of keep track of what I was studying, and especially if it were something Latin, he would sort of have a look at it and have a go at it, and we would talk about it. So that was a very nice thing.
It was wonderful for him too, I'm sure, as you're a father, and to connect with something that your son enjoys, that you enjoy, and particularly a love that you had that you didn't pursue ultimately.
I know. Well, my own older boy just told me last night in the course of a FaceTime chat that I asked him what he's taking next. He said he was so excited about next semester. And I said, what are you taking? He said, well, I'm taking the fall of the Roman Empire and Greek literature. And I practically fell off my chair. And so that made me happy. And I swear I never pushed him. So that's nice. So yeah, there is a nice sort of sense that your own interests have somehow, in their own ways, sort of inspired your kids. How could it not be?
Of course. It feels wonderful. Now, as for mythology, I mean, it's true. As young people, we, I'm saying, really young, like you were saying, around 10, 11, 12, we love stories and fables. And one of the things that I love about Jewish culture is it's filled with that too. So did you find that kind of resonance?
I didn't find the same kind of resonance. And in fact, I always felt a little guilty because, so many of the, as we know, so many Jewish holidays are actually commemorations of sort of barely escaping from pagan oppressions of one kind or the other, Egyptian, Greek, Roman. And I was always secretly rooting for the Greeks because I already was sort of a great fan of the Greeks. So, for example, Hanukkah is a commemoration of a survival of an oppression by an Asian Greek monarch, Antiochus. But I was always looking at it from the Greek point of view and thinking, well, actually, all Antiochus was trying to do was to uniformly Hellenize the people in his kingdom. And, you know, what's wrong with putting a statue in the temple, you know? So it was always very funny. I think, you know, obviously the sort of the Hebrew sort of mythology, the biblical mythology has its own flavor and also its own narrative technique. You know, one of the great essays about the Odyssey, actually, is by the German scholar, actually a German Jewish refugee, Erich Auerbach, who in the first chapter of his monumental classic called Mimesis writes about the difference in the sort of narrative techniques of the Bible versus Homer. So these are two very, you know, both traditions have rich mythologies, let's call them, but they're very different in character and tone, and also obviously in moral outlooks. And, you know, because I am, as described, you know, the Greco-Roman one seemed much more sympathetic, right? Narcissus is a much more appealing myth than what you get in Leviticus if you're a little gay adolescent.
And you knew you were gay? You were.
Yeah.
It was a different time than even, well, still, it's still hard to come out, I think, as a young person, to yourself and to others. Were you in a sort of environment that allowed for that and you felt comfortable with it?
Well, it was just so different. We're talking about the mid-1970s. This is 40 years ago. And, you know, my parents were liberal-minded people. They had gay friends. We knew they were gay. So I never thought my parents were going to be a problem, so to speak, although it was still difficult. But you have to remember, you're living in, if you're a teenager in 1974 or 1975, the entire culture is blank when it comes to homosexuality. You know, now you turn on the TV and there's 25 shows with gay characters, sympathetically portrayed gay characters. There are movies, it's in the air, people talk about it on the internet. You know, when I was in junior high school, you literally thought you were the only person like this in the world. You had no way of connecting. You had no way of knowing anything. So it was very isolating and very scary. And I think that's another reason why, you know, these Greek and Roman myths with their polymorphous perversity provide a sort of a, hate to use this cliche term, but it is a kind of a safe space to find objective correlatives to your own secret feelings. You know, here are people doing the things that you kind of think are the things you want to do, but there's nobody for you to talk to in the actual world. I think it you know, that dynamic also is likely to make you more literary, so to speak, because you find your outlets in literature, which is the only place it seems at the time where you can find people who are like you if you're a little gay adolescent. So I think that that's a very important, you know, it's worth underscoring how different that moment was. It's totally unrecognizable. Yes, it's still difficult, and yes, the degree to which it's easy to come out now, I think, is largely a function of class and culture, but overall, it's not even comparable. It's a different world and a better world, I would say.
Absolutely. So let's get into the myths, and I think, you know, the myth of Narcissus is such an interesting one in regards to you. I mean, I was recently interviewing Άγγελος Χανιώτης. He was saying, you know, it's not one of my favorite myths, he was saying. But I'm very curious. So when I say the myth of Narcissus, what's the myth to you?
Well, it's interesting because the name Narcissus, as many names with this ISSOS or ISSUS ending, seem to be very old names. They come from a sort of pre-Hellenic moment. And yet the myth of Narcissus is fairly late. You don't find it in Greek literature until the Roman times, basically. So it looks like, and this is always, you know, to talk about origins is always provisional because you always have to remember we don't have 90% of classical literature. But it looks like it starts to sort of be of interest in the 1st century BC. And the most famous, just to cut to the chase, the most famous version, which is the canonical version, which is the version that later inspires artists, paintings, other versions, is Ovid. Ovid in the Metamorphoses, which he completes, I think, in 8 AD while he's in exile, or right before he goes into exile, I can't remember. In book 3 of the Metamorphoses, Ovid treats the Narcissus myth in the canonical version, which is to say there is this very beautiful youth, and he is so infatuated with himself and spurns all approaches by other potential lovers because no one can ever be as beautiful as himself. And Nemesis, right, the goddess of just retribution, decides that he's going to get his. And what happens, but what Ovid does, which is so interesting, is he twins the Narcissus myth, right? So he catches sight of himself in a pool, falls madly in love with this ravishingly beautiful boy, realizes it's himself. He can never have it, right? So it's the fascination of the unattainable object, the yearning that can't be fulfilled, which is a component of all erotic and sexual yearning. And that's why it's such a powerful myth in the Western tradition. And he just pines away and fades to nothing, staring at himself languidly in this pool, and wastes away, and then is replaced by a flower, the Narcissus, right? There seems to be other treatments of the Narcissus myth, which has that basic structure. He's, which is, anyone who went to high school knows what this is like. He's the president of the class and the football homecoming king and all of that, and he's too good for everybody, and he's punished for it by himself suffering the unrequited love that he has inflicted on others. There seem to be versions of that already floating around in Greek authors writing in Greek under the Roman Empire, right? Half of the Roman Empire is Greek-speaking, so one has to remember that, Greece doesn't stop, and then there's Rome, right? But they intermingle for many centuries. So, for example, there's a poet, a very highly regarded poet called Parthenius of Nicaea, born around maybe 100 BC, who treats the myth of Narcissus. He lives in Asia Minor. He's captured during a war between Rome and where he lives. He's brought back to Italy. Eventually, he becomes the Greek tutor of Virgil. You have to remember, all Romans, educated Romans, are bilingual, and it's like us in the French. Everybody wants culture, right, by speaking a few words of French. So recently, in the past maybe 10 years, a fragment of a papyrus is discovered with one of Parthenius's poems, and it's about Narcissus. And it seems to, the fragment that we have supports that there was that version about Narcissus, right? He's mean to everybody. He's so beautiful. But in this version, he kills himself, because once he falls in love with his own reflection, he realizes it can't go anywhere, and he kills himself in a pool of blood. So that's maybe the mid-1st century BC, this text of this poem, whatever it may come from. So we're talking maybe about the 50s, 60s BC. About a generation later, there's another character called Conon, who seems to have also writing these sort of summaries of myths, right, which is a popular genre. And in his sort of version, the same thing happens, a violent death for Narcissus once he falls in love with himself hopelessly. What Ovid does two very interesting things. He doesn't have him kill himself. He wastes away. And that's interesting in Ovid, because Ovid twins this Narcissus story, which is all about sight and reflection and the visual and the unattainable visual object, as a revenge story for his ill treatment of Echo, right? So in Ovid, the myth cluster is not just Narcissus, but gains a lot of depth and traction by being twinned with the story of Echo. Now, Echo, so first you get the story of Echo in Ovid. And the story of Echo is that she's a chatterbox, a human girl, or a nymph, I'm sorry, who's a chatterbox. And her chattering at some point distracts Hera, or rather Juno, sorry, we're in Rome, from being able to keep track of Zeus's adulteries. And Hera gets so pissed off that she punishes Echo. And the way that she punishes her, because she's a chatterbox, is she makes it so that Echo can only repeat what other people are saying. And so this she does. And then one day, Echo, now forlornly only able to echo people, catches sight of Narcissus, eventually declares her love for him. He, of course, being Narcissus, spurns her. And she then wastes away out of despair, and all that's left of her is her voice. And, of course, it's also an etiology of how we get the echo, right? So the Echo story is all about sound and the aural, and she can only repeat sound. So it's an aural analog to the visual repetition compulsion, as if you like, that you get in the Narcissus story. The Narcissus story is a visual dead end. He can only look at himself. The Echo story is an aural dead end. She can only say the same thing over and over again. So Ovid gives incredible depth and complexity to what seems to be some kind of, recent interest in this Narcissus character by twinning it with the Echo story. And it's interesting because in Ovid's version, in Book 3 of the Metamorphoses, it's all about desire, right? Echo is being punished for interfering with Juno's ability to punish Zeus's adulteries, right? So everything's about sexuality, desire, illicit desire. Then she falls hopelessly in love with someone who falls hopelessly in love with himself. So it's a very sophisticated sort of mythic investigation of unrequitability. I wouldn't even say unrequited love, but, if this is a word, right? Unrequitability, And the way, and look, we've all had experiences of being more interested in someone than that person is in us. It's a natural part of one's sentimental education. And the idea of wasting away and only being able to repeat the same thing, that is the quality of unrequited love. It can't go anywhere, right? It's dead. It's a dead thing. And the deadness of the repetition of the sounds and the deadness of the infinite reflection of the self, excuse me, are so beautifully captured in the mythic narrative. So when we talk about the myth of Narcissus, we're really usually talking about Ovid, because he created from whatever was floating around. Who knows how many versions of Narcissus there have been. We don't know what the sands of Egypt will turn up in terms of new papyri that may have other versions, but he gives it a sophistication, an intellectual sophistication, and a moral, I would say, or at least an ethical component, right? Because she's punished, and then he's punished. Echo is first punished, and then Narcissus is punished for his self, literally his self-regard. That's all he can do, is regard himself, and I mean regard in the etymological sense, right, to look at himself. And they both waste away because these are non-productive, erotic pursuits, right? It's unproductive. It cannot produce. And the opposite of that, to have an erotic, a genuine erotic attachment to another person who reciprocates is productive, right? It enriches you rather than depletes you. And it's interesting that both Echo and Narcissus in Ovid's version literally disappear because they waste away, they disappear. It's a fascination. It's a brilliant little narrative.
Brilliant, because there's so many different reasons why. I mean, one, it's confusing as well, because we do kind of fall in love with ourselves when we love someone else.
Right. I mean, look, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but one could argue the Narcissus sort of elements of the Narcissus story are then, it's so rich and so fruitful because of Ovid. Let's not kid ourselves. Ovid is possibly the most influential of all the Roman writers throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, along with Virgil. I don't think there's anybody as influential. So this becomes incredibly alluring. And of course, if you're a painter, because of the high and the strong element of visuality in the Narcissus myth that Ovid codifies, right, it becomes irresistible to painters, right, to have, you know, the idea of someone who can't stop looking at something is, of course, what every painter wants in a funny way, right? And so the visual tradition in European painting of the Narcissus myth is a very rich one. It's fabulous. Caravaggio, for example. Everybody loves painting Narcissus. Also for writers, right? The idea of the visual double that is your other self, but of course, yourself can only be yourself, so it's also a dead end. For example, turns up in the picture of Dorian Gray in a different, right, where the image is sort of literally split off into the famous painting in the attic. So it has a lot of traction, but then, you know, towards the end of the 19th century, it gets into the hands of the newly born science of psychoanalysis, right? And I don't believe it's Freud who's the first one. I think it's Otto Rank, as I recall, who's the first person to write about narcissism as a psychological issue in the early 20th century. I think Freud wasn't as interested in it, as I recall. I think he only wrote one thing about narcissism. Rank, as I recall, is treating it as a pathology, right? People who are only stimulated by themselves. But I think you're right. Certainly there is an element, one could say, of narcissism in erotic love, right? You have to see something in another person that is alike in some way that creates a bridge for connection. That's a sort of healthy narcissism and sort of the hook, let's call it, to get you interested in someone who then, of course, if you have a healthy psyche, it's also their difference that's exciting to you in whatever way. So, you know, narcissism, which is a word that floats around a lot, particularly since I think it was in the 70s that the culture of narcissism, the great cultural critical study. So we now use this term rather loosely, but we all know what we're talking about, you know, and there's you know, I would say that one could argue that there's a sort of healthy kind of narcissism, which is limited, and then there's the overpowering, the real sort of pathology, which I'm sure we could all think of examples of, which clearly isn't so nice.
Well, I mean, I think that the description of narcissism, particularly around pathology, is in itself in flux. I mean, the actual description in I think it's called the DSM, which is the book on psychological pathologies. They've changed the definition of narcissism quite a few times.
That's interesting.
I thought it was really interesting because there are all these ways that we are, I think the reason why we relate so closely to this myth, you know, why it's so current, why I can speak to a wide range of people that can speak to it, is because there's so many parts of ourselves that we recognize within it. And getting to the more sexual issue, I read a quote by you that I think came from your first book. And I thought it was so fantastic because I had never actually thought about it this way, is that when two men make love, when a man penetrates another man, the receiver of that knows exactly what he's feeling. In heterosexual relationships, I mean, I know what it's like to feel as the receiver, but I don't know what it's like to feel as the giver. So there's a real interesting mirroring that happens in homosexual intimacy.
Right. I mean, you know, the sort of the great and odious and complicated tradition was that, you know, homosexuality was long regarded by the psychoanalytical establishment as a pathology and also in many schools of thought connected to pathological narcissism, right? Because after all, if your erotic interest is in, if you are a boy and your erotic interest is in other boys, then that is ipso facto narcissistic, right? You're looking for someone who looks like you in some gross general way. That's painting with a very broad brush, and I think there have been many revisions of that. Although one has to admit that it's also true, right? You are interested in someone who is like you. I mean, in some superficial way. So one of the things in my first book, The Elusive Embrace, which the title itself is an allusion to the Narcissus myth, right? This idea that you keep reaching for this other that you can't quite ever get because it's in some way not real. It's a fantasy. It's an illusion. In that book, I was both playing with and sort of playing against this Narcissus. I mean, Narcissus is the myth I actually treat at great length among the many that I interweave with my personal story. And to invoke the Narcissus myth and narcissism is always, to use it as a club to beat people with, right? And so my point, just to refer to what you were just talking about, was that, people keep saying that gay people are incapable of greater intimacy because of this quote-unquote narcissistic fear of the other, right? That it's safer somehow to love something that looks exactly like you.
In one very specific part.
In a very it's a superficial characterization, but fine. It's, in as much as that's true, it's true. But my point was, can one not, in fact, achieve a sort of greater intimacy because of this? When I'm a man making love to another man, I know everything that he is experiencing because I have all the same moving parts and not so moving parts, right? So isn't that a greater kind of intimacy, total knowledge, right? I mean, there's a reason that to know is also to have sexual relations with in English and other languages, in that biblical sense. She knew him, he knew her. Of course, being the Bible, you can never say he knew him.
It's true.
And so I was just playing with the idea that one has an incredible sense of intimacy in knowledge, right? Because you know exactly what it feels like. You know exactly what your partner is feeling because you have the same body to some extent. So I was just sort of playing with that idea of otherness, selfness, knowledge, and intimacy to sort of use Narcissus to push back against some of the arguments that have been made about gay people and their intimate lives.
Well, actually, when I read that, I was completely fascinated because I thought to myself, I immediately thought, and this is partially because I have, fear of missing out, but I immediately thought to myself, my gosh, I don't know what it feels like for Philip, my husband, and how wonderful, how intimate it would be if I actually knew that. And what a wonderful part of sexual intimacy amongst two men, or two women for that matter.
Yeah, it can be. But, one could argue back that each mode has its advantages and disadvantages, right? Because obviously, for most of the world, it's the otherness of the other gender that is exciting, the unknowability, right? One could argue that you keep having sex as a way of knowing more, right? That's an argument that can be made. You can never totally know, but it's a lot of fun trying, right? And there is also an equally, just to sort of turn these arguments around for the, to play devil's advocate, another argument, this is I must say an argument that is sort of informally, one hears a lot in gay culture, is that it's precisely the total knowingness that you can achieve in gay sex. Because you do know exactly what the other, or you're capable of having a understanding of what the other person is feeling, that it, one could argue that it makes it eventually much of a muchness and you have to find a different partner because there is nothing more to be known. Some people have used this for, or at least historically used this, and I investigate this idea in my book, that this accounts for the sort of culture of sexual play and multiple partners that has been for a long time a sort of component of certainly urban gay life, that the argument being, this is all in sort of quotation marks because we're painting with very broad strokes here, but that you make up in, for a lack of depth by a richness of multiplicity of partners, right? That's to put it very crudely. So, what's interesting to me and to us in the conversation is how narcissism, right, becomes the sort of epistemological tool for thinking about actually what happens between different possibilities for what can happen between people, either of the same gender, of different genders, opposites, selves, as they come together in an erotic way. And it is, whether you agree with it or not, it's an interesting tool, this myth, for thinking about sexuality and one's connection to one's erotic interests.
I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think that's why I was so much looking forward to this interview, because it's such a different aspect of this myth than what we've talked about, than what I've talked about with others. I mean, to look at this myth as a gateway to understanding our sexuality and the way in which we engage with our sexuality is just, and it's just wonderful. And obviously it's very significant for you because you titled your book after this myth.
Yeah. Yes, it is significant for me. I mean, on the one hand, I wanted to avoid the sort of history of clinical pathologizing of gay sexuality and using the Narcissus myth as a stick with which to beat us gay people. On the other hand, I do think it has a kind of usefulness. Also, I would say, apart from the sort of deeply psychological issues we were just discussing, in a more informal, loose, broadly cultural critical terms, I think this idea of self-reflection and being obsessed with, one's looks, let's say, is certainly an applicability in gay culture. Even gay people complain, about the extent to which appearance, physicality, the body are almost oppressively highlighted in popular gay culture. Especially the body stuff is really very strong still, and the emphasis on looks. And, I remember when I was growing up, one always heard this thing, if someone turned out to be gay, if people were gossiping, like my parents, and they would say, oh, well, he's so good looking, what did you expect? As if there was some correlation between beauty and gayness, which of course there isn't. But the fact that people felt it to be is so significant and interesting, and brings us back to our topic of not as it were, the reflective aspect of narcissism, but how important beauty is to the myth, right? Why is Narcissus so horrible to everyone else? Because he is so much better looking than anybody else that no one's good enough for him. And I can tell you, if you've ever been in a gay bar in your 20s, you know what that experience is like, usually from the receiving end, unfortunately, but I mean, proverbially, this was a behavior that one saw in gay bars when people still went to gay bars instead of hooking up online, which everyone does now. But, the idea that there would always be that sort of beauty who would just blow everybody off, So I think the Narcissus myth has its uses even in a kind of general, informal thinking about gay culture and why it operates that way. And I think many gay people would say this as well. I'm not saying anything that we haven't talked about over brunch, when we all have brunch together, right? I mean, gay guys, I know, will joke that we can actually tell the difference between a gay body and a straight body. If you have two beautiful gym bodies, you can tell which is the gay body and which is not the gay body, just because of these certain extra degrees of aestheticization, let's call it. So it's interesting. And again, it brings us back to Narcissus because, the interesting thing about Narcissus, as I said before, is it's not just about reflection. It starts with excessive beauty. That's almost the problem in a way, the sort of hubris that results from being too good looking. And I think that is certainly an element of gay culture that many people are struggling with, because it does seem almost that obsession with the bodies and the faces and the haircuts and the clothes and the whatever, which is very pronounced, is, something a lot of people have no patience with. And, I think it does blind people to the fact that there are other people who may not be have the most perfect bodies or the most chiseled cheekbones or whatever, but so it can be oppressive. That's why the Narcissus myth also becomes useful, because you think, anyone who's that interested in how they look is going to get their comeuppance. So there's also, a sort of satisfying ethical quality to the myth, which is, this is what happens when you forget that there are other people in the room who may not be as fabulous as you are.
Now, you are a very handsome man, and I'm sure that you were very handsome when you were younger. I mean, you have... For those, because this audio, you have really beautiful blue eyes. You do have a gorgeous facial structure. I mean, you're very handsome. What was that like for you then, as a young man? And
well, but the fact is that, and here again, to sort of drag the conversation back to Narcissus, which is much more comfortable for me.
Well, I would say
that the problem with being in this culture is it almost doesn't matter what you look like, because that's the whole point. That's why I find the myth so interesting, is that you're only aware of who's more beautiful, right? That's what the myth is about, right? That it's the most beautiful. You will, you're never going to attain to the ultimate perfection, because you're aware of how many more beautiful people there were. So, quite honestly, when I was in my 20s, I had no sense of what I looked like, because I always felt, compared to everybody else, like everyone else was having the fun and more fabulous, right? So, again, that's why this is a useful narrative for explaining, just basic things about human nature. And I think that a lot of people go through that. So look, I dated a model once. You want to talk about beautiful? I can tell you about beautiful, and he was always worried about not being as beautiful as other models, right? So it's this, it always reminds me of the great New Yorker cartoon where there's four people and a girl is looking at a boy and the boy is looking at a girl and that girl is looking at other boy, and each one is saying, boy, what a beauty, and you're always looking at somebody else. So I think, again, the Narcissus myth reminds you, that's the whole point of the reflection aspect of the myth, that it is look what happens when you put two mirrors up to each other. It's infinity. It's an infinity of emptiness, right? That's what you get when you endlessly reflect, right? So it's not productive. And so it doesn't matter how good looking you are, what you look like, how great your body is. It doesn't matter. That's the sort of awful joke about a culture that pursues that beauty myth, is that it's unfulfillable, which is, of course, the whole point of the Narcissus story, right? He's not even beautiful enough for himself, right? He can never even, he thinks it's somebody else, and he dies for pining away. So it's also a what do you call that? It's a morality tale. It's an object lesson. And I think to some extent it's also, to get maybe a little highfalutin, right? It's also about narrative. I think, Ovid and the Metamorphoses, inventing a new kind of genre, a new, without the kind of narrative that we expect from other epics, a through line like the Aeneid or the Odyssey or the Iliad, which is composed of these discrete elements, and yet it seems to have an arc. And so there's also a fascinating kind of meta quality about the Narcissus myth, which is about how we tell stories and how to end, when a story starts going around in a circle, so to speak, what is that about? Look, the word reflection is also a word for thinking, and that gets interesting. So it's, for a little myth that doesn't take up a lot of space in a very great epic poem, it certainly seems to have legs, as we say. It just seems to be about a lot of things more than meets the eye.
Absolutely. I mean, and particularly because the lines are so fine. Reflection, for instance, there's a lot of encouragement to reflect on yourself, to think about yourself, to better understand yourself. And yet that can go too far. I mean, at what point have you gone too far?
Right, but I think, again, and now we're, say, using the Narcissus myth in a highly metaphorical and symbolic way. Self-reflection, which we are encouraged to do, certainly in the post-Freudian era or in the Freudian and post-Freudian era, right? People endlessly reflect on themselves and their lives. Many of us do this once a week at least, right? And some more. But I think what the myth as a instructive fable reminds you that self-reflection ultimately is meaningless without a context of relating to others, right? So you can be therapized beyond belief. But if, presumably the point is that you're training yourself to also relate to others, right? If all you do is reflect on yourself, psychotherapeutically or whatever, then that's no good, right? I have a old friend in New York. I used to tease that, his 29 years of therapy made him very good at analyzing what's wrong with other people, And so, what is the point of all this self-regard? When does self-reflection become self-regard? When do you start husbanding your intimate, endless aperçu about yourself? And when do they stop being useful? Look, I think there's also a literary application or a danger, which is particularly interesting to think about in the age of memoir, right? Which is, how much is enough? Which is sort of funny for a person like me to say, who's working on my third memoiristic book. I'm sure I'll find out how much is enough when the reviews come out. But, so that's interesting. And I think that so there are all these levels that overlap, the psychoanalytical, the cultural critical, the literary, and I think that the Narcissus myth is a warning against too much self-reflection, that there are always other people in the room. And when you forget that they are there, metaphorically speaking, then you die, right? You fade away. That's also the horrible irony, is he who is so important to himself ultimately disappears through self-obsession. He's not even there anymore at the end. So I think it's sort of a useful tale at so many levels. It can be applied in so many ways. That's why it's fun to think about.
Well, the unrequited love is also, you reminded us that it's actually he thinks it's someone else. It's not himself that he is actually falling in love with. It's someone else.
Yeah.
I mean, at least in his mind.
Yeah.
So, he's getting retribution for what he did to Echo.
Yes. Right. That's also the other fascination about the story, is he doesn't realize it's himself.
And that he bears the consequences of having been cruel, seemingly cruel to someone else by not giving them the love that they needed.
Right. So it's for all its playfulness and for all its glamorous sylvan settings and the couched in poetry of a very high order, this is a deeply moral story, which is funny because, of course, Ovid is always thought of as the sort of frivolous, playful, sexually daring chronicler of the less majestic aspects of Roman life and culture. But I think actually the whole poem is actually deeply moralistic in many ways, because it's always showing you retribution for bad erotic behavior and in fact other kinds of bad behavior. So there is that.
But that's the kind of attraction to erotic behavior, is that it's bad and that there's some sort of there's a part of being attracted to eroticism that is the forbidden, that is that which is not allowed.
Yes, but although I would, I think it's worth pointing out, at least while we're talking about Ovid and the ancients, that, the field of sexual play that is legal and licit and customary is much broader than it is for us, right? That sexual morality is a lot less rigid than it is if you're coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? So that's why the Metamorphoses is so interesting, because you're actually in a world where relatively little is erotically off limits. Certainly, relatively, right, compared to us. And even so, it's very interested in when you cross the line, when you do things that are bad. That's worth thinking of. It's worth keeping in mind when sort of evaluating its sort of moralistic quality.
Well, I was understanding that these myths are taught in Greece. They're taught to children at quite a young age, and so the things that ultimately you would want to impart on your child by teaching them this myth are that one should not focus too much on themselves, that one should not prioritize beauty above so many other things, that one needs to be cognizant of the love that they receive from others, that love does not exist in a vacuum.
Certainly that would be the advantage, right? When you're learning, I don't have specifics about the, Greek lower educational tradition, but, you're also in a country with an incredibly strong Orthodox Christian presence. This is a country that's officially Orthodox, so that balances, all this pagan stuff, I would think. But certainly it's in that sense, as we've been discussing, it's a useful and instructive myth with a strong ethical component. I think a lot of young children, this is certainly true for me, are interested in Greek myths because they sort of glamorize bad behavior more than they, glamorize good behavior. But I would say this is one of those myths that definitely has a strong point that you can't miss. You cannot get to the end of the story and have any doubt about where you're supposed to land ethically.
Now, you're writing your third memoir, so and so there is this sort of reflection that's going on in your life. What is it that compels you to learn more about yourself, your history, who you are as a person, and why you are that person?
Well, I would sort of start out by saying that memoir is just a sort of a useful term for I would say, a category that I would rather refer to as personal narrative. So even memoir, I actually have written an essay about memoirs. It's published in the New Yorker a few years ago, in which I talk about how just the word memoir is sort of infected with a sense of narcissism, to come back to our magic word, right? That, I would think unfairly, I'm just not a novelist. I couldn't make up a story if I tried. I don't have a fictional bone in my body. And so I use things that have happened to me and my family, but in the same way that a novelist uses invented things to explore issues. If I had written 3 personal narratives, all of which were about me exploring my identity, I think that would get tired after a while. Inevitably, it's a sort of sub-activity of these kinds of books, but not the point. But the extent to which I am protesting in this very conversation is also a measure of how negatively narcissistic the genre of memoir has come to be thought of. right? That's why I'm so eager to dissociate myself from it in this conversation, which is kind of funny.
Well, but it's an accurate dissociation. That's why I think the myth of Narcissus is, again, so interesting, and how it plays out also on social media. This notion that we're sharing parts of our lives so that we can reach out and actually connect with someone ends up being misinterpreted as us being focused on ourselves and what we're doing.
Right. Right.
And so it's very murky. That's why there's this fascination. When something is murky, you just want to question it more.
Yes, right. But I think that, I think maybe the myth of Narcissus and its lessons can be a useful sort of literary tool, so to speak, to help us distinguish, when someone is actually, as it were, pathologically narcissistic in their writing, and when one is merely using the self and its reflections in a interesting and constructive way. One can write a long list of memoirs which are not narcissistic in a bad way, so to speak, right? And then one can write probably an equally long list of memoirs that are narcissistic in a bad way. It depends.
Exactly. I mean, yesterday, Laura Kipnis originally studied video art, and in the early years of video art, the artist took video of themselves. And I had to correct it because Chris Burden actually shot himself. So the artists constantly used themselves as subject because that was the only subject they had to hand. So, yeah, that has seemed incredibly narcissistic on the one hand. But then on the other hand, it just is part of an exploration of a practice. So it's all these fine lines, which I think is fascinating.
The tradition of the self-portrait is a long and honorable one in the visual arts, right? So as it is in literature, it all depends. We have to make the judgment call.
And the other, just around the self-portrait, is that, I love seeing studies of artists who have done multiple self-portraits that look quite different from each other and analyzing. And what's interesting about the myth of Narcissus is that his own reflection is shifting as well because it's on water. So
presumably, right.
So there's all these, because when something shifts, you become more engaged with it. As we were talking earlier about how, in homosexual eroticism, if you're getting the same sort of feeling, you're going to want something actually different.
Right.
So that too is the myth is endless, truly.
Yeah.
When you look at
it's good, as they say, it's good to think about, right? It's good to think about. It's a useful myth. Look, that's why it's become one of the dominant classic mythic narratives, right? Everybody knows when you say the word Narcissus what you're talking about, and it's, unless you're a botanist, it's not a flower. And look, there are many other myths in the Metamorphoses that have not become bywords for this or that. Right, the quality of the myth is interesting because it has the texture of a fable, an instructive fable. That's why it sticks. That's why it's useful. And there are many myths that are. It's to use an older myth that has become equally expansive and useful culturally. The Oedipus myth. Right, some myths have these kinds of this kind of staying power, and that's not an accident because they seem to say something that's true about the world, about the way our lives are. Oedipus does that. The Oedipus myth does that. The Narcissus myth does that. These seem to say elemental things. The myth of Pentheus and the Bacchae seems to say that about the failure to balance different aspects of one's personality, the libidinous and the rational. That's why these things live. There are other entertaining and complicated and fun myths, but they're not culturally useful in that same way. They don't seem to get at something elemental about human experience, and that's why we're not talking about them today. Right? Others are. Arachne and the weaving contest, is a myth about hubris, about overreaching. They're satisfying, and that's why we keep repeating them. That's what it means to be a classic.
Those were the words of award-winning author and critic Daniel Mendelsohn. To learn more about his work, please visit Daniel Mendelsohn, mendelsohn.com. This interview is part of a series of podcasts called Narcissus Now, featuring artists and thinkers from Narcissus Now, the Myth Reimagined, an arts and ideas festival celebrating the newly renovated Onassis Cultural Center in New York. For more information, please visit onassisfestivalny.org.